Hi, Tony again from All the Remote Things. I'm here with Ben Ford. How are you today?
I'm very good, thanks, Tony. Thanks for having me on.
Good. Actually, what time is it in your part of the world?
It is 7:46 a.m.
Yeah, AM. So you're you're near Kent, not far from London. So just to give the viewers an idea of how remote we are with this stuff, we tend to talk to people all over the place. So fantastic. Look, as we do, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, sure thing. So I'm Ben Ford. I'm a software developer by trade. Before that, I was in the military. You might see from my little pie wedge up there. I was in the Royal Marines for 4 years, which I discounted for a long time until I started to run into kind of strategy, priority, leadership issues in many of the tech companies I've worked at. And now my focus is really on trying to marry those two worlds of taking some of the useful parts of military doctrine and practice and merging that with cutting edge tech to empower people, especially as we move into this remote world, right? It's all about empowering frontline people rather than making them jump through needless technology hoops.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So talking about technology hoops and technology, one of the reasons we got you came to the attention of the cast, and you're also in our remote AF community, by the way. So I'll just mention that while I'm at it. So if anybody's listening, we have a remote AF community. You can get to that remoteaf.co. Just click the button, join the community. Ben's there and many others. One of the great things that you're doing is a thing. Well, so as I came on to this cast, I was all prepared to talk about commando development, which was awesome. I could see all the Army references, but you informed me it's now been rebranded. But you've been doing a lot of work with software platform, and I think you're calling it Mission Control. So do you want to talk to us a little bit about what it is?
Yeah, sure. I'll just maybe dig into the reasons why as well and the evolution of this. So Commando Development was my kind of personal consulting company. I thought once I sort of rediscovered all this military stuff, I thought, the way to get it out there was to, talk to leaders, teach people about the OODA loop and situational awareness and mission control and all these really fantastic ideas from the military that just need that kind of translation layer. And that was okay. But the problem that I keep coming up against, and I started coming up against this as a on the tools software developer, DevOps engineer, that type of thing, is that we've got this proliferation of operational software, right? It's easier than ever before to spin up a software company, which means that niches get more and more addressable and therefore smaller and smaller. So now in a modern business with modern ways of thinking about technology, you might have 50 to 100 software as a service things, I just call them things, that let your operational people do what they need to do. So marketing have got a tech stack, ops have got a tech stack, customer support, products. They've all got these, things that make their life better and allow them to move quicker, which is fantastic for the operational side of things. But when you take a step back from the operations into, say, the middle office or step away from the front line and try and make decisions and set priorities, I realized that what I was coming up with is not a problem with theory, although that is, these ideas aren't well enough known. The problem is actually capacity, right? The problem is aggregating all of that information to something that you can make a decision on, and then following that decision through the kind of organizational OODA loop. We talk about OODA a lot. And so the last couple of years, I've actually been sort of back on the tools, figuring out a tech stack to do that piece, which is to, very lightweight, sit in the middle, aggregate all of the operational data into a central place that you can then put dashboards on and have the breadth of data and insight that you need to make the right decisions. And that's the kind of the genesis of Mission Control.
Yeah. The reason that came so roaringly to my attention. So in the remote AF framework, we have the concept of the virtual or remote obeyer. And obeyer, obviously, we're getting all the Japanese terms out now, OODA loops and obeyers, but the interpretation of that is the big room or the big room for information, and we have the inference of MARDOs, which are the windows for information right into the organization. And what you're talking about here is really what we have been talking about for some time, We have the concept, you have the physicality of it. So it's a very interesting thing. So I didn't interrupt you, but I just wanted to make the point that we've been thinking about this for some time, and the reason I was so keen to get you on is because here's somebody who's actually taking the physical approach. And a lot of people are asking us, okay, we get what you're doing there and we get that. What's the technical implementation that we can do with that? So it's very good to hear this from you.
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it, that everything, all of the analogies that we have about that, Gemba and the room idea, they're all physical, because up until 10, 15 years ago, the state of the art was to gather people together into the right place and have that happen physically. And we're now some way beyond that. Remote is here, and it's not going away. And it's not just remote, it's also temporarily remote as well. So you've got async as well. And I think that's where technology really shines, because while all of this technology is being built, companies like Twitter and LinkedIn and whatnot have been building an absolute plethora of open source solutions. And everything in my stack is designed to be open source, so it's very cheap to run. You run it yourself. It's designed to be something that you build internally rather than another product that you get in. It's very much a service, and increasing the capacity of the organization is really the theme of it. But just to kind of go back to that idea, when I was in the Marines, I did a tour of South Armagh in Northern Ireland, which is sort of on the tail end of the Troubles. And the idea there is exactly the same. So we had this old mill, Bestbrook Mill. We had the bottom floor was the kind of the command wing, I guess you could call it. And one of the rooms there was a physical room. Ops officer had his office. I was a signaller. I managed all the comms equipment. And on the wall is a gigantic map board of the area of operations. And part of my job was to take radio reports from all the people on the ground and plot their position, not just their current position, but where they've been. So what you had as you walked in is you had an immediate one place to look and see everything that was happening on the ground, everything that was relevant. And then, all of the kind of peripheral parts of the organization, the int cell, the observation towers, which were there at the time, would all be feeding information into this one place, so that when people did need to make decisions, or when we did need to react to something, everything that you needed to make that decision and to have that timely situational awareness was right there. And it's, what I'm doing is absolutely no different. It's just, I have a bunch of different tools now. It's not greaseproof. It's not a grease pen on a Perspex overlay anymore. It's a BI tool and a streaming data platform, but it's the same idea.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because to give you sort of the origin of the virtual remote Obeya from that point of view, myself and one of the other co-creators, Phil Gudzinski, we've been doing some stuff around that in the physicality, and we had the concept of the Obeya, and of course forward to creating the remote agility framework and being thrown into the remote frame. One of the conversations we had, we'll have to let that go. But we both went, well, hang on. No, we could do this in virtual, and the tools are there for this now. It's really about, okay, what do we need to have? What's the right information in the information flow, which is, going to pair into a conversation you and I just previously had, is that information flow. And then what are the different things that are required to get you where you need to go to underpin that? And that was where that sort of concept came along. And now you're taking that to the extrapolation of actually making that happen, right, with the technology, because there's no good reason now that you can't do that. It's more about, what do we need in there? What's the information that's right for the context of the organization to allow that information flow?
Yeah. And that's also a very technology adjacent question, because all of these frameworks that the likes of the big software companies have built are all about extracting, insight, I guess, from what's going on around you. So they're a great fit for taking a stream of, I think of everything in data streams. I spent a bit of time in finance, and all of this stuff in the OODA loop has really kind of doubled me down onto discrete things that have concretely happened in the real world. And the algorithm that you use is essentially to iterate that time stream, and it's called a fold. You fold it into some kind of state, and that state is then what drives your representation of the world. And it's a super lightweight, there's a single thing you have to keep in your head when you're designing a system like that, which is, I have an existing thing and I have something that's happened, and I want to put those two things together and build a new version of the world. That's it. That is the concept. And there's a whole load of other kind of software development nerdities that I won't get into now, but it means that you can chunk those things together really well, and you can sensibly attenuate the amount of data that's coming to you from the outside, which is obviously, if you just stream everything, this is one of the major problems I see with leadership in technology companies. Everything comes to the leader, and no matter how talented you are and intelligent you are, that will burn you out and overwhelm you because there's just too much.
And I think we and yourself saw a lot of that as we moved into much more remote, much more hybrid, much more distributed. Because I say that we moved into much more because it was around before that, right? And it's just that certain world things have moved that along and made sure that we're now never going to let that go back into the bottle, so to speak, Genie-wise, right? So,
yeah.
But the interesting thing about that is what you're saying there is that we see that information, so much of it is predicated on what they were doing before, not what they're doing now, and not what they need now. And that means that the leader becomes the central hub of it. Yes, there's your first problem. We need to look at how we can ensure that information is sliced and diced and is transparently transposed up and down the stack. But the second thing about that is, what's the right information to allow transparency? What's the right information to allow that understanding of how you can make the right directional decisions based on what you're seeing, and you're not spending 33 days sifting through a report or something to that effect. And how do you design your system of work to allow that information to flow? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so actually, there's something that's been rattling around in my brain. So with we're recording this at a time where Russia has invaded Ukraine, and the expected outcome has massively failed to materialize from their point of view. In fact, from anyone's point of view, everyone thought that this would be over very quickly, and the force disparity was such that Ukraine would swiftly be rolled over. In actuality, the opposite has happened, and Ukraine have been much more agile. Obviously we're talking here from several layers of media reporting and no actual knowledge, and I don't have any actual knowledge, but the principle is exactly why remote work has become a thing, right? It's small, distributed teams making their own decisions, moving faster, out iterating, and it's pure OODA, it's pure mission command, which is something that I'm sure we've all talked about on this podcast. And you mentioned in the run up to this, I did a talk at the NATO Command and Control Center of Excellence, and I made the point there that when you're operating in a complex environment, you're trying to find a fit for. There's a great book called The Snakes and the Dragons, which looks at this kind of conflict through an evolutionary lens. There's another book called The Origin of Wealth by Eric Beinhocker, which looks at it, evolution applied to economics, or the whole ecosystem. And what you're doing there is you're trying to find a fit with your environment. You're trying to find a method of operations which is a multi-dimensional potential set of options, and you're trying to find the right configuration of those options such that you succeed versus fail. And there's a very, very simple way to explain this, which is what I finally kind of got around to writing yesterday. If you reduce those dimensions down to one, you have a single dimension, which is you're trying to fit that dimension with the environment, and that is exactly the formula of energy transfer in physics. So if you reduce that down to one, the two things that you need to worry about, the two levers that you can change, are the equivalent of your thermal coefficient, how effectively information, which is the same as energy, moves through your organization, and the surface area that you have. The surface area is the points at which your organization touches the external environment. So distributed decision making is like increasing your surface area, because you're increasing the organization is flatter, so more people are doing the work and more people are interacting and learning from the environment. And then this system that we're talking about, this kind of, mission control data flow, is like the thermal coefficient. It's how well, with what fidelity, the information after it's been learned from the front line moves through your organization and gets aggregated to the point of need. So that's the kind of analogy that I've been using. It's very simple physics formula to explain, well, not to explain, but to provide a thinking mechanism around this.
Yeah, it's an interesting, and as we were talking about before, what that actually means then is that you're actually starting to strain the right information to the right place at the right time, so that it can be used as expediently as it can, rather than having this mass amount coming through that you actually then have to actually filter. Because that's the typical temporal way it was done previously. You get a whole bunch of information, then you apply filters to it, etc., etc. But what we're talking about here is we don't have time for that anymore. We have to move. It's the VUCA environment, to overuse a word, but the reality of it is we do not have that time. So we're better off getting the right information at the right time, in the right place, to allow us to do that.
Yeah, and following on from that, there's also the problem that you have, the entities and the concepts that you need to think about in your business. A customer, or a location if you're a restaurant, or whatever those entities are, and the relationships between them. As these operational tools proliferate, those entities get spread out. So part of your customer data is in one system and parts in another. And unless you've got a good way of, when you do this aggregation, also bringing that together and composing that data into a sensible model. And by the way, most businesses at the moment, still the state of the art is a poorly paid admin person using Excel to try and do that, which absolutely sucks. It's just
correct.
Yeah, it does not work. I mean, if you've got a cutting edge product team that's costing you an absolute fortune, and you're doing all of your middle office and back office and finance and admin stuff in Excel, you've got your spending priorities messed up, and the bottleneck is no longer going to be building and shipping product, all this stuff that we agile software people talk about. The problem is going to be the infrastructure upon which that is built, and the machine that drives that. And I've seen that. I mean, that's why I'm on this journey, is because as a software engineer, I ran up against the rocks of internal friction and chaos, and I couldn't do my job. And I've spent the last 5 years really trying to figure out how to unblock that part of the bottleneck.
Yeah, and it creates a whole bunch of. So the other thing alongside of that, if you think about it, and the conversation I often have is there's a whole bunch of cottage industries built around that. There's a whole lot of empires built around that, and there's a whole lot of money being sunk cost into humans plugging the gap of technology.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that phrase, humans. I use it all the time. If you've got a machine and you've got humans acting as the cogs in your machine is not serving the people. And that's exactly the wrong way around to have it, right? Your people should be doing the human things of making decisions, being creative, communicating like we are, generating new concepts and new ideas. And your machine should be there to support them and to remove a bunch of the cognitive load that they would otherwise be spending Friday afternoons preparing reports that nobody reads in Excel.
Or worse, Access.
God, yeah.
We've all come across that as well. Yeah, I want to dig a little bit deeper into that. You prefaced it just there about the NATO command presentation that you did. What I really liked about that, when I was looking at it and listening to it, was one of the things that interested me most was your thoughts around that top-down command and control is out of balance to thinking about more about bottom-up process, and we're giving that control to this in small guide rails to people. Talk a lot about that, because that really lines up with a lot of what we think about in remote AF as well.
Yeah, so I know you guys talk a lot about McChrystal's ideas in Team of Teams, and there's Turn the Ship around as well. But the underlying principle there is this concept called mission command, which is that in a fast moving environment, the the team or the organization that reorients itself quickest wins. And this is a, you know, obviously purely OODA idea as well. So the central issue is that, you know, leaders, by the time they get up to a leadership position, are no longer the best at doing their job, right? Or doing the job that they used to do, because the job's changed. You know, new people come through with different skills, different technologies. I mean, I still enjoy writing code and I still like it, but I'm almost certain that I could spend a very little amount of time and go and hire a team that is better at doing that kind of day-to-day stuff than me. And I absolutely would do that anytime. So the flip side of that is that now you've got these people at the front line who are in contact with the environment. If you've designed your organization right, you know, they're in this kind of constant dialogue with the customers. Well, the thing that's going to keep your organization on the rails and on track is responding to that. It's not ideas that the leader has, right? It's, I mean, you know, the leader might have a certain amount of experience and some intuition, well, a lot, not a certain amount, a lot of experience and intuition about industry and macroeconomics and things like that. But actually, day-to-day reaction to what's going on around you is driven from the bottom up, and it always has been. And our kind of Western organizational paradigm over the last, I guess, like, you know, couple of 100 years, I suppose, you know, Taylorism and things like that, they have their place, because you have to have that kind of situational awareness of what's going on, and you can absolutely optimize processes and things like that. But the information flow has to be a sensory mechanism that starts at the edges and works its way in, rather than the person on the inside taking a wild swing and saying, this is what we're going to do, follow me.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, when we talk about what you're attempting with mission control and that whole obeyer, there's an intrinsic link here to what you're just talking about, right? The two are not disparate. You have to have them both working in sync to enable that. You know, we talk about it a lot, you know, linking your strategic intent to your delivery and vice versa, which sounds easy, but what you're talking about is exactly that, right?
It is, yeah. And it's, you know, it's not one or the other. It's a, you know, it's these two processes are always happening. I mean, one of the ways I think about it, I read a great book that really kind of sums up a lot of this stuff. Scale by Geoffrey West.
Right.
So, you know, his background is the Santa Fe Institute, physics. And when you get physicists going and working with economists or, you know, other kind of you know, non-hard science backgrounds, you tend to get some really interesting discoveries and breakthroughs about the underlying processes. So one way you can think about this is, and I'm not sure how valid this is, and, you know, there's always a risk of trying to analogize this that you oversimplify, but I kind of like this one. So the bottom-up mechanism is like the nervous system of an organism, right? It's excitatory, it's non-linear, it's you know, many long periods of nothing, and then suddenly you stick your finger on a stove and it's like, you know, the balloon goes up, and it's outside to in. And then you've got the economic part of the business, or the circulatory system, is much more steady state. It's pulsatile, it's more linear but not completely linear. So, you know, it can respond to demand, but it's not, you know, it's within 10 times, let's say, you know, the capacity can only be expanded by, let's say, 10 times. And so one of the problems that I see all the time is that we try and apply the model and the mechanisms from the circulatory system to the excitatory system, and vice versa, right? We try and have ideas in sprints, but ideas happen when they happen, right? Learning happens when it happens. You can't stick it into a 30-minute retro every 2 weeks. Right? It happens all the time. It's an ongoing process. So I think that's one of the things, that getting the technology in there to increase the capacity of the team means that stuff can be coming through all the time, and it can be a constant kind of process of monitoring that, rather than trying to fit that, you know, the learning into a small amount of time. It can be a constant background process, as it should be.
Yeah, that's correct. Look, I want to dig a little bit deeper into something, you know, pick you up a little bit on something I just heard there, and it also has to conversations you and I've had as well. is when we first started doing this distributed stuff, even when we first flew into the pandemic, et cetera, a lot of the excuses were around, well, there's no way to do this. But the exceeding impact of that is that the creation of tools is amazing. What is there now to allow us, including what you're doing, and we were talking about how the impact of that now is that there's no excuses to not be doing the right things. What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think I find the word excuse a bit problematic because everyone's doing their best. You always are. People get overwhelmed. You mentioned the word VUCA earlier. The effect of operating in a VUCA environment with a non-VUCA operating system is that you get overwhelmed very, very quickly. So in effect, many companies are, through no fault of their own, operating inside their own OODA loop, right? They've cut off the ability to act because their delivery cycle isn't quick enough. They don't have sufficient, sufficiently good observation because this sensory mechanism isn't working. So what you end up with is, you're stuck in this kind of orientation decision cycle without proper, and then at that point you've become a closed system, and entropy starts to rise in any closed system. Another lesson from thermodynamics. And so what the kind of subjective experience of people in that organization is like is just sheer overwhelm, and you're kind of in that kind of downward cognitive spiral, at which point it becomes quite survival oriented. I've been in multiple tech businesses that feel like they're in this situation, and because the priorities aren't clear, there's a lot of wasted work. Because there's a lot of wasted work, resources are scarce. Because resources are scarce, you don't invest in the right systems. Because the right systems aren't there, the whole cycle continues. And so I think that's also another reason why I've kind of switched from this kind of top-down, explain this stuff to people, because if you explain it to people and they're in that situation, they can't do anything about it anyway. Whereas if you come in with a set of technologies that are aimed at increasing capacity from the front lines first, well, then you start to unwind that negative spiral by giving people capacity back. And then once the capacity is back, some of these ideas can land a bit better and can be actioned rather than just, oh yeah, that's nice to know. Now I'm back into my 18-hour reactive day. Cheers.
Yeah, I guess excuse was let me categorize why I say excuse, because when I talk to organizations a lot, it's a really, well, that's the way we've always done it. So I do take your point, and there are those organizations that are stuck in that loop and they can't get out of it. But there are also a lot of organizations that are still stuck in the loop of that's the way we've always done it, and we're not willing to step out of that to go to the new technologies and think about the new ways of working or design to the context of. And that means that they're trying to continue doing what they've done in the physical environment, in the virtual or the digital environment, and that brings them unstuck. So I guess that's probably more where I'm aiming that thought track.
Yeah, that's completely fair. I mean, that's a very common failure pattern as well, isn't it? Is not recognizing that the environment that you're in has changed. You've got your favorite tech or your favorite way of doing things, and then I don't know, Google comes into your space, or somebody invents a new technology, Blockbuster, Netflix, physical film, although maybe that's not such a great example anymore. Physical film versus digital photography, that kind of thing. But again, I think that's kind of a problem of pattern recognition, isn't it? If you don't have these kind of sensory mechanisms in place, by the time the time that you could have recognized this, if you had like a forward-looking sort of very strategically focused view of the world with kind of tripwires of, okay, this is what we might threaten us in the future. This is when you work backwards and you say, this is what we might see if that were to start to transpire, and you can react to it then, versus you don't react to it until it's like literally staring you in the face and you're about to, and I think but that's a very, very difficult thing to do, because that mechanism takes a lot of resources. And if you're, I don't know, let's say you've got financial backers of your company, and in one form or another, and you've found a way to make money. Well, it's very difficult to resist that incentive to just spin the machine, right? Crank the wheel, make hay while the sun shines, and not notice that the sun isn't shining anymore until it's too late. And I mean that's a perennial that's been around. That thing's been around since before technology, I think, for sure.
Yeah, that's right. And unfortunately, there's so many cases of the landscape littered with those that didn't. So the lessons are there to be learned, but maybe not being learned. So yeah. And I think we could delve into that quite deeply for a very long time. Look, we're very close to the end of our time. Ben, how can people get in touch with you? How can they learn more about mission control as opposed to Commando?
Yeah, so I'm Commando Dev pretty much everywhere. So I'm at Commando Dev on Twitter. You can find me with that on LinkedIn as well. The business URL for that is Get Mission Control, and control is ctrl.io.
Fantastic. Look, thank you so much for giving us your time and spending time with us on all the remote things. If anyone's listening to this and you really enjoyed this, don't forget, like, subscribe, amplify. Also, don't forget to think about joining our Remote AF community at remoteaf.co. All the remote things for all things remote. Thank you again for being on there with us today, Ben.
My pleasure, Tony. It's been a really good conversation.